Welcome to all of you, and we're really delighted that you came here today. Before I introduce what we're doing in the panel, let me just remind you, we're going to be here for 90 minutes. If you get hungry, there's food and drink in the back, and it's great to see you all. I'm Fran Berman. I'm the Director of Public Interest Technology Initiative on the UMass campus. That's an all-campus initiative. And on behalf of Dean Carl Rethenmeier from SBS and the PIT Initiative, we want to welcome you. I wanted to give you just 30 seconds on PIT, but the Public Interest Technology Initiative is about studying whatever you're studying using the tools of modern technology and thinking about the public interest, social responsibility. I'll give you a pitch for a course we're teaching for the very first time next semester. I'll be teaching it. It's CICS 290P on its way to becoming a Gen Ed requirement. It's Introduction to Public Interest Technology. You are all welcome to take it. I need some buddies to help me pilot the course, and it would be great to have as many of you as choose to take it. So that's my pitch for today. There is nothing more public interest than the upcoming elections. And this is going to be a really interesting conversation where we think about it. But let me just tell you what's at stake. I copied down some stats. So this midterm election, which is held, by the way, on Tuesday, November 8th, so mark it in your calendars, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are going to be up at stake. 35 of the 100 seats in the Senate are also going to be contested. 39 state and territorial gubernatorial elections will be held. And there is a whole bunch of state and local elections, school boards and state representatives and all kinds of things. All of the results will determine, who leads this country, and in particular, it will determine who the 118th Congress is. This will be the first election, by the way, that follows the redistricting that was done by the 2020 census. So all those discussions about gerrymandering and privacy and census and all of that, they'll all start playing out now. So this is a big deal. And to try to I'll just tell you up front, none of us actually knows what's going to happen, but to try to understand what might happen, who might be involved, what the issues might be, we are really excited to have a bunch of experts with us today. And so we are going to have them introduce themselves to you. So this is how our hour and a half is going to go. Each of them are going to take 5 or 6 minutes to tell you who they are, what they care about, what they study. Then we're going to ask them some really interesting questions, including really interesting questions by you guys. So if you raise your hand, we're going to, include you in the conversation as best as possible. And we're going to try to get at the bottom of, how should we think about this election? I would be remiss if I didn't say one of 250 times during this panel, go vote. Please go vote. You represent everything about you, your age, your demographic, where you come from. Even if you think it doesn't matter, go vote, and go vote in all of the elections, not just the federal election. So now you have 249 times more to hear me say this. To start it, we have some really exciting stuff that's kind of hot off the presses. So I'm going to have Tatish start and introduce himself to you.
We need the mics. Can you hear us if we sort of project? Everyone's good? Okay. That's my recording. Okay. All right. So thank you for that introduction. I'm Tatish Nateta. I am a professor in the political science department, but I'm also the director of the UMass poll. So the UMass poll is the polling operation here on campus. We were founded in 2010, and since that time we've done about 40 polls. I'm going to have to take a look at my own slide here, so I'm just going to angle myself a little bit. We've done a number of elections at the federal level and at the state level. We look at a number of issues, sort of hot-button issues, abortions, critical race theory, the insurrection, reparations. And we just finished a national survey of about 1,000 respondents. We were in the field from October 17th to October 19th. And what I want to do, just give you a sense of what we were looking at and what we found and how that sort of can influence the direction of this midterm election. So just as a foundation, this is looking at midterm turnout rate. And what we know is that the turnout rate at midterms historically is much lower than the presidential election. But what we saw over the course of the last election, the last midterm election, is high levels of turnout. So about 50% of eligible voters turned out to vote. That is a record. If you can go back in time, you can go back to 1922. It's the highest level of turnout in a midterm election since the early 1920s. And so we are really interested in getting a sense of whether or not that level of excitement and interest and engagement is going to be seen in the 2022 election. So we asked a number of questions about people's intentions, people's feelings about the election. And so we asked, how excited are you? How excited are Democrats generally? How excited are Republicans to vote in the 2022 midterm election? And what we found here is that the majority of respondents and Americans expressed high levels of excitement for themselves to vote, for their party to vote, for the sort of engagement that we see in a midterm election. And that's true particularly amongst Democrats and Republicans, and less true of independents. We also asked about the importance of the election, right? So you're hearing a lot of discussions about why this election is the most important in our lifetime. And by the way, you hear that almost every election. Every election, federal election, has become the most important of our lifetime. But we asked about the future of the nation, the future of the Supreme Court, the future of democracy, and we can see again high levels of engagement and high levels of importance associated with this election as it pertains to the nation, the courts, as Doug is going to talk about, and our democracy, which is one of the central frames used by the Democrats in this election. We also asked, how important is this to your party? And what we see here, and these are Republican and Democratic respondents, that about 80% of Republicans and Democrats feel that this election is important to the future of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And here are the issues which people really are most concerned about. So we asked very sort of pointedly, what is the central issue which will determine your candidate choice in the 2022 election? And what we can see here is that the economy is the central issue that 1/3 of all respondents selected. And then we can see some other interesting findings here. The health of our democracy at 16% is the sort of second issue of importance going forward. And issues like COVID really aren't hitting with the public or the Supreme Court. Crime is increasingly seen as an important issue, and we can see that in the campaign as well. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly here. And then we're really concerned about the aftermath of an election. So what's going to happen on November 9th? And how are people going to feel on November 9th? So we asked whether or not you would be afraid if the other party won the midterm election. And we can see here that there's high levels of fear by both Democrats, but particularly amongst, by Republicans, but particularly amongst Democrats, that if their party loses the midterm election, loses control of Congress, this is going to elicit a high level of fear. And fear is something that gets people to turn out to vote. Then we asked whether or not you'd be angry if the other party won the midterm election. And again, we see high levels of potential anger if the election does not go the way of your partisan group. And so with that, I just want to sort of hand it off. And we're going to be here for some more specific questions about the poll and our thoughts about the midterm. Here are my colleagues on the poll, and I'm going to hand this off to Rodrigo.
All right. So, first, they asked me to say a little bit about myself. So my name is Rodrigo Dominguez Villegas. I am the Director of Research at an institute called the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute, which is a multi-issue think tank at UCLA, where we study anything related to the Latino population in the U.S., from health to education to, of course, democracy and representation. And so that's why I'm here. Our motto is that every issue is a Latino issue, not just immigration. Though my background here, and I'm a UCLA alum from a PhD in sociology, is my academic research is on immigration, so I'm happy to answer questions about immigration in the Q&A. But today, I'll present a little bit about our docket on Latino voters and their importance for democracy and their growing numbers. And as you can see in there, I've been, doing my rounds on TV and stuff in Congress, trying to, pass some legislation that would facilitate voting for Latino voters. Let's get to what is the importance of Latino voters in this election. So Latino voters have been on the rise and are the fastest growing demographic group in the electorate. We've seen that since the election of Barack Obama in 2008, they represented about a little bit less than 10% of all eligible voters. And that went up to almost 14% in the 2020 election. And we're expecting this year to almost reach 15% of all eligible voters. In terms of Latino voters as percentage of registered and those who actually voted, they're a little bit smaller because some people didn't register or didn't show up to vote, but still growing very rapidly. Those are the national numbers. Now, what's really important is that the Latino electorate is a huge percent of the electorate in many states that have a lot of congressional districts. Biggest numbers are in New Mexico, Texas, California. But here I put in squares 3 states where there's going to be Senate elections this year that are going to be very contested. And where Latino voters represent a large proportion of the electorate. So that's Nevada, where up until today, it seems like there's a statistical tie between the 2 top candidates for Senate. Arizona, that switched from Republican to Democrat in 2020, and both Senate seats are now controlled by the Democrats, and one of them is up for election. Latinos make up 28% of the electorate. And then there's states like Georgia and Pennsylvania, where even though Latino voters, do not represent as large of a percentage of the electorate, the margins are going to be so close, and the margins in 2020 were so close that a lot of people are saying that Latino voters made the difference in a multi-racial coalition together with black voters back in 2020 in electing Joe Biden for the presidency and the 2 Senate elections that the Democrats won in Georgia. One of them is up for re-election this year, and Latino voters are going to be at least 5% of voters there. So a growing impact in terms of Senate, in terms of statewide elections by Latino voters. And then something that I forgot to say is that, out of the 34 congressional districts that Cook Political Report right now has classified as toss-up congressional districts, in at least 12 of them, Latino voters are 25% or more of the electorate. So there's 12 congressional districts where there are going to be a huge impact. 5 of the toss-up congressional districts, Latino voters are 50% or more of the electorate. So they're really going to be determinant in the balance of power in Congress. A few trends to watch to gauge the impact of Latino voters actually on November 8th and after. First is what's going to be the closing message from both parties, right? And polls show that es la economía estúpido for Latino voters. Definitely it's the economy. There's a recent poll from Pew Research Center shows that 80% of Latino voters say that the economy is their top 1 issue. 80%, right? So in the UMass poll, we saw that for the general electorate, 33% said that the economy is the top issue. For Latino voters is way higher. There's other issues that are important. Abortion has increasingly showed up in the list of top issues for Latino voters, but over and over, regardless of the poll, it's always the economy. The second thing is the turnout of young voters. The Latino electorate is the youngest electorate, median age of 30, compared to the median age for white voters, which is 43. And so it's really important for both parties to turn out young voters if they want to get Latino voters. The third thing is that we've done some research that shows what actually impacts the turnout of Latino voters and what are successful ways of getting them out to vote. And all of our research shows that the most successful campaigns are in-person get-out-the-vote efforts. So those are when people go actually knock on doors and speak to people in, Spanish, English, or the language that they can speak, culturally competent messaging. But the degree to which both parties are investing in that get-out-the-vote campaign and surrogate organizations, in Nevada, for instance, the Culinary Union, in other places, and how much work they do in these 2 or 3 weeks will really matter a lot. And then these are some districts that I'll be watching on election night. Our institute actually puts out really cool data on election night of how Latino voters are showing up and voting. But some important ones are New Mexico 2, California 22, 27, and then 2 in Nevada. In all of these, Latino voters are really a really big portion of the electorate. And with that, happy to answer any questions, but with that, I'll pass it on to Carrie.
Is this working? Okay, great. So, I got it. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, sure, yeah. Fun. Fun. Let's see, where's the little light? Oh, okay. So great to be here with you today. I'm coming from across the river at Smith College. I am in the program for the study of women and gender. I'm a lawyer, and I'm a scholar of social movements. I also am a regular writer for Ms. Magazine, and I have a column in the Daily Hampshire Gazette, which is our local newspaper. Actually, it comes out 4th Thursday, so look for this Thursday. Unlike the previous 2 speakers, I'm not a researcher of elections and electoral behavior, but I follow it very closely as a reporter for Ms. And I am very much covering the women's movement and what's happening out there among particularly young women, but women generally, and how they're reacting to the current situation in the United States. So, oh yeah, that's me. I didn't have a very good starting slide like you did. But I will say, if you want to see my writing, MsMagazine.com, author Carrie Baker, or follow me on Twitter. So for Ms., actually, let me go back. For Ms., I am their lead abortion writer, and I've been covering Dobbs and the reaction in the states to Dobbs and the bans that have been happening. And so, again, I'm going to talk a little today about how that's affecting voting, registering to vote and intent to vote, and what issues are important, particularly to young women. So this is a map. So the New York Times has an updated map. It's updated regularly about what's happened post-Dobbs. Some of you may not be familiar, but on June 25th, June 25th, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade in 1973 recognized the constitutional right to abortion. So the last 50 years, people have had access to legal and safe abortion. But on the 24th of June, the court allowed states, they overturned Roe and allowed states to ban abortion. And it was quite a shocking ruling. It was entirely a result of Donald Trump packing the Supreme Court with MAGA Republicans. By a 6-3 majority, they overturned a 50-year precedent. It was really unheard of. It was the first time ever the Supreme Court abolished a long-established constitutional right. So this is where we're going. As of the latest was the 13th of this month, 14 states now fully ban abortion at fertilization before people are even pregnant. You don't get pregnant until the fertilized eggs implanted in the side of the uterus, but they've banned it even before that. Other states have banned it early, like 6 weeks in Georgia or 15 weeks in Florida. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner states that protect abortion rights, and then, and so Guttmacher Institute, which is a research institute around issues of reproductive rights, anticipates that over half of states will ban abortion eventually as a result of the Dobbs decision. And this has created really difficult situations, particularly for young women. According to a poll that I'll talk about in just a minute, young women are making plans about where they're willing to live and work based on whether abortion is protected or banned in states. Over half of young women have had their plans impacted in some specific way, like they've considered moving or are making plans to move to a state where abortion rights are protected. 10% have already declined a job in a state where abortion is banned. In addition, not only is this decision of Dobbs affecting their plans, but young women voters and people close to them are taking actions in response. For example, they're purchasing and obtaining long-acting birth control, the morning after pill, and the abortion pill. So this isn't just an abstract issue. This is a very concrete issue that's actually affecting young women's plans for their lives, and they're taking immediate action right now. And by the way, this is something that crosses party lines. It's not just something that Democrat women are doing, or young women. It's also Republican. And again, I can provide this survey to you. It goes into much more depth about how women are planning for this. By the way, I just, in passing, want to note that many of the states that are banning abortion are also the same states that are adopting voter suppression laws. These issues track each other very closely. And I think that's, I mean, that's a complicated question as to why. I won't go into it, but I think it's definitely worth noting. So now, before I get to the survey about how what people care, young people in particular care about in vote, young women care about in voting, I just want to note that across party lines, people do not support abortion bans, and they do not support the Dobbs decision. They do support Roe. And so you can see in this, I'll use this little handy-dandy light. This is the percentage at which people oppose different sorts of restrictions on abortion and bans. Prohibiting abortions even in cases of rape and incest. 83% of people oppose that. 70% of Republican voters oppose that. Making it a crime for a woman to get an abortion that would result in either fines or prison time. 71% of voters in states with full abortion bans oppose it. 64% of Republican voters, 94% of Democratic voters. This is not a partisan issue. And the reason that these bans are happening is that legislatures in many states have been captured by an extreme that does not represent the will of the people. So I think this is really important to keep in mind when we look particularly at young women and what they're thinking about the next election. So this is the survey that I want to, and I stupidly, because I'm not like, pollsters like you guys, I didn't actually put the data of where the survey is, but I can share that with you. But this is what young likely voters care about. Young meaning 18 to 29. These are the issue priorities for women and men. And you can see there's quite a divergence for women and men. 55% of young women, one of their issue priorities is abortion. Only 18% of young men. Versus inflation and rising prices, 33% of young women, they care about it. 36% of young men, that's closer. But note that young women care a lot more about abortion than inflation and rising prices, significantly, by a count of over 20 points. Other issues like health care and prescription drugs, racism, gun violence, affordable housing, they are dwarfed by young women caring about abortion. And, I think that in part, the decision has just come down. These state bans have just gone into effect. Women's lives are being, in concrete ways, being impacted by this. It feels very real. So according to this research, and this is a poll by Lake Research Partners across 9 battleground states, find that among young women, abortion and women's rights are the most important and highly motivating issues determining their vote. And this is interesting, people that are pro-abortion rights care a lot more about this than people that are anti-abortion rights. 35% of pro-abortion rights voters prioritize women's rights and abortion in their vote decisions, compared to just 10% of anti-abortion voters. Among women voters of all ages, so not just young women, but all ages in battleground states, abortion and women's rights are tied with inflation and rising prices in determining their votes. So while young women feel particularly strong about this, women of all ages really, really care about this. In the words of the editor of Ms. Magazine, despite constant reports in the media on inflation and rising prices as the top issues this election, abortion and women's rights are actually the most important for young women. The overturning of Roe v. Wade has lit a fire under women voters, and especially young women voters who have the power to determine close elections. And again, this polling is from the 9 battleground states. And I can say a little more in a minute about what those states are and why those are particularly important states, but I've probably already gone on way too long, so I'll pass it over.
Queue up your questions for Carrie and everyone, because this will be a great time for you to ask about these issues.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. Thank you all so much for coming out. So I'm Doug Rice. I'm an associate professor of legal studies, political science here at UMass. My research, what do I look at? Generally trying to think about the role of courts in the policy process, and really in American democracy, what are the roles of the courts? I focus particularly on the Supreme Court generally, but I've done a lot of work around lower courts and state courts, and I'll talk about really all of them as I get into this a little bit. So we wanted to focus a little bit on the big issues and trends that we're thinking about heading into this election. As someone who's studying the Supreme Court, I want to draw a little line between two things. One is the policy outcomes that are coming out of the court, which I think are really motivating voters. The other side of this is something that is, I think, really important as we think about sort of prospectively, where is this country going? Are Democrats, and Satish in your slides earlier sort of alluded to this, are Democrats actually motivated by the court itself? And I'll split that in two different ways. First is thinking about nominations to the court. Are Democrats going to sort of, in some of these battleground states, Senate states that have these seats up at stake, are they actually going to turn out and thinking not about the economy, but really thinking about, in a way that Republicans have in the past, thinking about the possibility that they can sort of grab one of these Senate seats that are really important for them with a Democrat in the White House, being able to control the Senate and control appointments to the courts. Slide didn't make a positive case for this early on, but it does. It's a really important one that we sort of think about. It's also really important in the post-Dobbs world if Democrats are changing this, because historically, some recent research has suggested that Democrats really hadn't been thinking about this, that there's an asymmetry between the parties. And that's the latter piece of this. There's the picture here on the right comes from a recent New York Times editorial that was really from some law professors pitching the fact that liberals have to start thinking about the Supreme Court differently. They have to think about it more in the way that conservatives and Republicans have been thinking about it for some time now, thinking about it as a political institution that's potentially not an ally. So very much the liberal thinking around the court historically has been sort of with this Warren Court era, like they're going to uphold the law, they're going to follow what we think is supposed to happen. It's suggestive that there really needs to be a change in the way that liberals are starting to look at the court and Democrats are thinking about the court. That said, when we've seen some of the initial polling, it sort of suggests that maybe that turn in the attitudes of liberals and Democrats hasn't happened. Instead, they're still looking at it as an institution that's sort of beyond reproach in some ways. Those efforts at judicial reform aren't going anywhere if we don't have real mobilization amongst Democrats to actually do something on that front. That ties into the second thing that I wanted to talk about. We haven't had normal elections in a couple cycles. And that's problematic in a bunch of different ways, but there's an angle that gets into the courts and the latter two things that I'll talk about here. So the first part about this is just whether or not sort of your election outcomes are accepted. The line that we see here on the right is very much a 2016-2020 presidential election line, right? If I win, then the election was legitimate. Nobody cheated. If I lose, clearly something bad happened. Some people were up to something, right? And so that's a line that we're seeing a lot amongst the candidates sort of heading into this election. And it's something that ostensibly will end up in our courts. The justices will have to potentially the Supreme Court, but potentially also states will be wrestling with these questions as they sort of go along. It also ties in, though, to something else that's going on. And Carrie, you alluded to it on yours, which is that as much as we talk about sort of attitudes and how those attitudes are going to connect to sort of outcomes, there's a real disconnect that's starting to happen between the ways in which our elections are operating and sort of disconnecting us as citizens from the actual outcomes that we might be able to see through elections. The Supreme Court has a case before them now that they'll be hearing that's based on this really fringe theory called the independent state legislatures theory. Folks might have heard of this before. It was most recently one of the guiding lights for Mike Pence that was supposed to tell Mike Pence that on January 6th he should just ignore some of those electors and put forward some new ones, right? And so it's now been expanded into a different area, and that different area is basically saying that all those gerrymandered maps that are happening in at the local level in states like North Carolina, all those gerrymandered maps that would have written with like really partisan gerrymandering. So North Carolina, the example is it's pretty even state party-wise, but the maps that they're drawing are like, I think 9 Republicans and 2 Democrats is basically like the ostensible outcome that you would have from that state. When it goes up to the Supreme Court, one of those cases, they're sort of challenging this partisan gerrymandering, clearly motivated by the partisan element here, trying to ensure that Republicans are going to win. When it gets up to the Supreme Court says we can't touch it. It's too political. These partisan gerrymandering cases aren't something that we're going to sort of get into the thicket with. So they'll step back. What's happened in the meantime, though, is that state Supreme Courts had actually sort of stemmed the tide, right? They had stood up in a number of these cases and said, these violate our state constitution. So this independent state legislature theory, though, is going to say that instead the legislatures are left up to do whatever they want, and the state courts can't review it. What does that mean if the state courts actually come in and say that? Well, state courts can't review it. Federal courts have just said they're not going to review it, so the states are going to be free to draw up whatever map that they actually want to along those partisan lines. So there's a cries that this is sort of histrionics about the end of democracy around Moore versus Harper, but there is a very sort of dark story about where this might be heading. So there's a real eye for me right now on like, as abnormal as our recent elections have been, there's a real possibility they're the most normal that we're going to see going forward. The last one, then, is what's going to happen in these state Supreme Courts. Because, as I just said, these have sort of stemmed the tide of some of the things that the Supreme Court's sort of saying, we're not going to touch that, we're going to leave it to the states. So about 50% of state Supreme Courts actually have elections this year for their judges. And not only that, you'll notice that some of our battleground states have them. Michigan, Ohio, North Carolina all have elections this coming cycle. And it's going to potentially flip the sort of, not always the partisan element of this, but it's going to flip the composition of those courts such that they would be more amenable to many of these really explicitly gerrymandered maps. The other thing that's happening in these state court elections is they become really political. There's been, for about 30 years now, money pouring into state Supreme Court elections. They've basically realized, like, we can dump a bunch of money here, get judges on these courts, and then be able to win lots of victories at the local level. That's also expanded up now to include the most recent cases. And there's going to be a number of different instances. There's I think it's in Ohio, where Ohio or Alabama has a case like this, where there's a bunch of ethical questions. There's being the judges that are sort of openly campaigning on their politics at this point, and what they're planning to do once they're judge politically, something that they're, by virtue of their ethical codes, not supposed to be doing. So that's the other thing I'm looking for. How are these directions, sort of what's going to happen with these state Supreme Courts as we go forward, and how is that going to tie into what actually happens with our elections? How is that going to tie into what happens on abortion policy? I'll stop there, though.
All right, that's a lot to digest, even if you didn't have any lunch. And I think what we're hearing is there's a lot of stuff to look at. There's, who might vote, who might not vote, what are the issues. And I have to say, if you're hearing things the way I am, which I don't necessarily assume, a lot of this is a huge bummer, right? So let me ask the skeptics question. And I have some questions here. And the skeptics question is, do elections matter? Think about the problems we're having with gerrymandering that's not equitable, that's not fair, with voting rights, with the power of lobbyists, with the power of big business, with this discrepancy between what polls say most Americans want and what actually happens. And so the question for our panelists is, in this day and age, do elections matter, or do they do the job that they were supposed to do? I don't know. Who wants to go first? Carrie?
Well, I'll start just because I did mention how voters actually support abortion rights and states are banning abortion. So, what's up with that? How's that happening? And I guess I'm going to just generally say a lot of our voting systems are not set up in a democratic way. Just take Congress and the Electoral College. This was established during a period when African Americans were enslaved in the United States, when there was sort of a battle between North and South around that, and the whole setup of the Senate. The fact that 2 senators represent California, which has, so many people, and 2 senators represent Wyoming, which has so few people, already is built into the system a lot of unevenness and lack of democracy. But I also think that, there's a lot of not playing fair by the rules, too. I would just to talk about the Supreme Court. Mitch McConnell upheld, when Scalia died in 2016, in February, Obama nominated Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. And Mitch McConnell, who headed the Senate at that point, just refused to move forward with the nomination. It was his constitutional duty to do that, and he just didn't. It was unprecedented. And 10 months went by. And then when Trump won, then he appointed Neil Gorsuch to the court, who was one of the majority of Dobbs. Then a couple years later, Kennedy stepped down so that Trump could appoint Kavanaugh to the court. And then literally just weeks before the 2020 election, Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies. And despite being consistent and saying, okay, let's wait until the new president gets elected to appoint a Supreme Court justice, Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett, and Mitch McConnell jammed through the nomination in just weeks. RBG's body was not even cold when Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett. So that's how the Supreme Court got a 6-3 MAGA supermajority. I've only recently started talking, people historically on the court have talked about conservatives and liberals on the court, but actually I think we have to talk about it as far as party, because it has become a political institution, and they like to pretend for many years that they're not, but they clearly are. And so I talk about the 6 MAGA Republicans and the 3 Democrats on the court. And that's how we lost Roe. It was not a democratic process. The way those justices got on the court was not democratic. And that's just one case study. You could look at a lot of these states where, there's different strategies that are being used, often, not fair and sometimes illegal, to pass these abortion bans that are so against public opinion. And that's one reason why pro-abortion rights candidates or advocates are trying to get state referendums, because it gets popular vote. So you look at Kansas, which was aunties were trying to pass a referendum to basically divest the Supreme Court of Kansas of the power to be able to rule on abortion. In Ruby Red, Kansas, 59% of people voted against that to protect abortion rights. So I think if we have real democracy, abortion rights are protected, but our democracy is so captured now by the right, and not even by Republicans, because it's by the extreme right that doesn't want to play by the rules.
So do elections matter, Tatish?
Yeah, I think elections matter, and some elections matter more than others. So I think that's geographical. There are some states, particularly in this election cycle, in which you have much more competitive elections that will determine the future of the Senate. And determine the future of the House as well as governor's mansions and state Supreme Courts. I think some elections matter more than others. In our minds as Americans, we have this belief that the presidential election is the most important election. And you see this in terms of turnout levels. And so in trying to understand why it is that in 2016 or 2015, Obama was unable to put Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court, it's because in 2014, we had historically low levels of turnout in the midterm election. And so the notion that elections don't have political consequences was one that we believed, I think, as a nation, but all of the examples that you provided sort of have told us that each election, whether that's a midterm election or a presidential election, state-level elections, even local elections, have their consequences. I think the story of elections not being normal is also a story of increasing engagement, right? And so people recognizing the impact of elections on their everyday lives, on the future of the nation, and on the story they want to tell, the next generation about who we are and where we're going. And so I think elections matter. In the sort of short run, it is really about focusing on those places in which they're highly competitive elections. But in the long run, I think Americans are becoming well-versed in the notion between their individual rights and the collective rights of the nation.
So I want to get to you guys, but I'll add an anecdote. I will channel Sherilyn Ifill. So I got to see Sherilyn Ifill speak last spring in Boston, and someone asked her this question about, do elections matter? And she said something really interesting that provoked my thinking. Maybe it'll provoke yours as well, which is, she said, we usually go and we see on the ballot the races we're familiar with, who's running for president and maybe who's running for, Senate or Congress. But there's all these other races, and you might not know who they are. Who is the local judge, who's running for school board. And she said, when we think about decision-making power and what happens in our communities, a lot of it happens through those names that one might skip because you don't know them. And in thinking about this, it's really true that there's a lot of people running for office, including those of you who might want to run for office. You start in your community. And that's how you kind of learn the ropes. That's how all of the people we're probably voting for learn the ropes as well. And being more thoughtful about who they are, what they represent, and the kind of power they'll have in your community matters. And I thought that was such an interesting response to that question. And it actually made me scrutinize much more. Who is running? And don't just skip that name, figure out what they're about and if I agree with that. So I'll pass that on. Rodrigo, how about you?
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things. Starting right after what you just said, I think, even in Massachusetts where you might think that elections don't matter, there's ballot initiatives, right? And so there's 4 questions this year and we've seen in the past when those questions are asked that the margins are very small in approving or or rejecting certain things. Me being in California for some time, in California there's like 20 every election cycle, and they really matter for everyday's lives. Like there's things, this year about whether or not to grant licenses to undocumented immigrants. That matters for their everyday life. And it might be very close, the results there. So yeah, local elections, ballot initiatives, there's like so many other things. But also, I am not the kind of person who's a skeptic about the purpose of elections. And I think politicians come up with very creative and very disgraceful ways of suppressing the vote precisely because elections matter, right? And they have come up with ways to especially keep women and communities of color away from the ballot box because they know that if they show up, a lot of things would change. And so it's not out of nothing that they are coming up with all these, legislation across states to try to keep voters away. And also gerrymandering is another thing that also shows how, they're trying to pick we're supposed to pick our representatives. Representatives are trying to pick their voters, and they're doing that because they know that elections matter.
I'm going to go to Doug, but I want you guys to be prepared to ask questions too. So after Doug, I'd love to hear what you think as well.
I'll go really quickly. No, it's fine. Definitely not. So I want to say two things on it. One is, I was surprised to teach you didn't mention it because I saw it up there earlier. They absolutely matter at the local level. One of the things that we've seen at the local school board elections, these have been really, really outrageous in recent I guess years now. It starts a little bit around COVID, but it dates back. An old colleague of mine had written a book called 10,000 Democracies that focuses on these local school boards that are, the history was like teaching of evolution, but now it's stuff around like what books are we going to ban, what stuff can't we talk about, what is the critical race theory. I have lots of friends that are still in the South that are sort of teaching in public schools that are basically like abandoning the job because they're like, I can't actually teach here anymore. And if we think about sort of those local races, part of the reason that the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court stuff ended up popping and so much money got dumped there is because a bunch of folks realized that that's really good return on investment. If we go to these local races where they're very powerful and we put a bunch of money into it, the other side's not going to be able to withstand that. We can end up getting say on all of these policies locally and at the statewide level. And so while we focus so much on the big questions and the big races, so much of it is at that really hyper-localized level. And so you should be 100% turning out just for that reason. The other part of this is, I mean, if we think that democracy is in crisis, there's like there's two questions then, right? And I'm working with a colleague here studying Russia, and one of the things that really has been striking to me in looking at Russia is that one of the patterns that's happened there is they're talking about protest, and that's what we've been studying is protest patterns in Russia. And there's all these questions about, like, why aren't they protesting more, right? And really what ends up happening is you have, like, disengagement. Like, they just didn't want to be engaged with the mess anymore. And that's one of the things I think we have to sort of fight against, is we have this messiness, purposeful messiness in many respects. And there's an inkling to be like, well, that's really ugly and I don't want to be involved with it. To your credit, I'm looking around the crowd and it's young folks. That's not been true for young folks. You all have been running into this battle very laudably, and so I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but I think that on this question, it's really important to sort of continue to encourage folks that it really builds up a civic character, builds up our willingness to be engaged, and to keep that sort of that habit going forward.
Fran, can I jump in real quickly?
Yes, please do.
And as this conversation is going on, one of the things that I kept thinking is we're all talking about the practical implications of elections, but there's also the symbolic, right? And so you go back to 2008, and why is 2008 such a historical election? It's because it was the first time that the nation sort of put aside its racial history and elected an African-American person to president. And just looking in Massachusetts, the argument is, well, there's no competitive elections, Democrats are going to win, but there's some historic potential elections. We could elect our first LGBTQ governor. We could have a full slate of statewide officials that are all women. We have a number of black women running for statewide offices. And that's just here in the Commonwealth. And you can think about the races all over the country in which you have these individuals as a result of the sort of increasing engagement in politics who have stepped up. And these are individuals who historically have been on the margins of society. And their election or their potential election could bring perspectives into the political realm that will have the practical implications, but also the symbolic.
I always think this is a really weird thing because what you're saying, Tatish, in a way, is something I've heard from other people, which is, we're in the Commonwealth and people are pretty, somewhat homogeneous in the way they think about things. And so why bother if that's your point of view? And it's like, if you're in the majority, you should bother as much as if you're in the minority. It's an orthogonal issue, right? It's like you vote because this is your country too. And you vote because that's one of the ways you get your voice out and you get your opinion heard. And if you're in the majority, great. Then maybe you're happy on election day, and if you're the minority, maybe you're unhappy. But in any case, it's your country. So it always seems like a weird argument to me. Okay, so thinking about any questions? Anybody want to comment on anything? Yeah.
Can anyone direct me to a resource on the U.S. campus that could help me register to vote?
This is great. And the question, if people didn't hear it, is there a resource that we here at UMass have that help you with where to vote? Yeah. Do we have something at UMass, or is this something one would go to, the general internet and maybe try to figure that out as well? Because I know there are resources there.
MassPerg. I think MassPerg has an effort to register college students. I believe if you go to the Secretary of State website, there'll be some information as well. But there are a number of organizations on campus that can assist in registering to vote, and then that's just the one step. The second step is telling you where to vote and providing resources regarding information about ballot questions as well as candidates. But I would start with MassPerg, which is a nonpartisan, non-ideological organization.
So I'm a data scientist. I'm going to crowdsource this as well. How many of you are involved with something or know is something that is getting involved, a group at UMass that is getting involved in elections from whatever their point of view is? Anyone? Yeah. Could you talk a little bit louder?
Yeah, at Smith, the Smith Dems are doing registration on campus, and I imagine that Smith or UMass Dems and Republicans are probably doing. So I reach out to the political groups on campus.
If you have a party affiliation and you want to be involved in this, I just heard a really fascinating This American Life podcast. I don't know how many of you listen to that from time to time, but they had one about how parties are thinking about poll workers. So poll workers are just volunteers who have a little bit of time who are willing to do things. And, all ages, shapes, sizes, whatever. And so there are some ways to be involved in the election beyond just voting. And that's something to think about as well. Rodrigo, I think I clobbered you.
I was going to say the deadline is that October 29th to register. And so it's really important to get it done really quickly. I am not a citizen, so I'm not a voter, but I believe that there's same-day registration in Massachusetts. Am I wrong? For all of you voters. But anyway, it's something to look into also. If you miss the deadline, which is Friday, I believe, or Sunday, there might be a way to go show up at the polls on November 8th, and still there's no same-day registration?
There's no same-day.
They brought it up. The Secretary of State has approved.
All right. And you cannot do that in Massachusetts?
Not yet.
But anyway, deadline is the 29th.
4 days.
Okay, wait, say that again, Ray. October 29th, okay. You have to make sure our information is good. Yeah.
I know you asked about registration. There's some packets in each RSD. When you go get your packages in each dorm, there is a pile of registration, voter registration packets that you can just grab them, fill it out,
And you can do that and then bring it back or share it with the.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. I think turnout matters. I think we're hearing that turnout matters, and turnout for particular groups whose focus is all manner of things, an issue, a challenge, representation, that matters. And I don't know, you guys are my hope because I think the world that you're going to craft is important, and I think it's overwhelming to figure out how, but voting is one of your tools. And so, okay, now I only have 248 more times to remind you of this. Yeah.
I'm wondering about how much issue salience and, also mentioning the not wanting to deal with the entire mess will play into this election, be it people saying, Dobbs leaving the mind of people as it was a couple months ago, or the threat to democracy since January 6th was years ago. Just how much will that play into the election? How much will it play into it?
Good question. How much will the issues play into it? Doug? All right.
All right. Okay. So, so it's interesting in that most elections boil down to economic concerns. At least that's the idea. And that looking at the sort of overarching national economic conditions will then help us to understand whether or not a particular party will gain or lose seats. And I think that is a reflection of what we thought were normal elections. And over the course, and this is a point that Doug made, over the course of the last 4 to 6 years, we haven't had those sort of normal elections. And so one of the central issues in this upcoming election, as you can see here, of course, is the economy, but one is the health of the democracy. And so this is the central issue of Democrats in this election, and you're hearing it from prominent Democratic elected officials. You're hearing it in Democratic media circles that the future of the democracy, the health of the democracy is on the ballot. And I think it encompasses issues like abortion and the Supreme Court and the sort of rightward turn, the sort of embrace of ideologies of white supremacy as well by particular quarters in our politics. And so I think although this is not 1/6 or January 6th insurrection or a particular candidate, it's really the recognition that if you want to fight for the democracy and maintain the democracy and protect the democracy, that you need to engage in the democracy. And that's something that I think is a central issue for many people in this race, alongside the economy and alongside more specific issue areas.
Can I quickly say something? So I think that's true, like obviously, but I think it feeds into what's a really interesting debate that's happening right now. Lenore Palladino was supposed to be able to join us. She unfortunately wasn't able to because she wasn't feeling well, and so she's an economist, and one of the things that she was going to talk about is sort of the state of the economy, and in particular, one of the things that I think I can say for Lenore, one of the things she was going to talk about is like the state of the economy is actually pretty good. The economy is doing well, and it's a really interesting question that I think Democrats have sort of wrestled with as the numbers, as we've gotten closer to the election and looking at sort of things like this, which is if voters care a lot about the story that the economy is bad and Democrats are talking about how the democracy is failing, that issue salience sort of question that you're getting at means that they haven't been pushing back maybe on this economy, the success of the economy. And if the thing that sort of is pinging with voters is, oh, the economy is going south, I'm losing money right now, then all of a sudden they're not voting on the basis of the democracy sort of failing. And it's a really troubling sort of dynamic, right, where it's if you're just sort of like, well, the democracy will probably hold. I got to worry about how my bank accounts are doing. But there is this, I think you've seen certainly the leading Democratic officials have sort of pushed the health of our democracy. I think Biden was just out there with a line about the democracy's on the line. But there's been a pushback that maybe what they should have been talking about all along is that he's actually done really well with the economy, and he should have been running on the fact that he's done well with the economy.
Carrie, you had something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the women's movement, the Democratic Party has always been very shy about abortion because they felt like, okay, we got Roe, we just shouldn't talk about it. It's a losing issue. And the women's movement has really been pushing the Democratic Party now to talk more about that. And Biden actually just recently, last week, gave a big press conference where he said if we keep the Senate and pick up 2 seats, we'll pass the Women's Health Protection Act, which would protect abortion rights. And so that was just really interesting because they've historically not wanted to talk about that. And you see Republicans on the other side not talking about abortion because they know these numbers that most people support it. So it doesn't help them to talk about it largely. But I will say that what the women's movement is doing, so the key are for the Senate is these 9 battleground states. And those races are neck and neck right now. They're determined by just a small sliver of voters. And so what the women's movement is doing is mobilizing young voters, particularly young women voters. Feminist Majority has hired campus organizers on states in the 9 battleground on college campuses in the 9 battleground states, and are getting young people registered and getting them to turn out to vote. Also, there's other organizations that are trying to get young people, like what's it called, Next Generation. Next Generation America, which tries to get young people that are just turning 18, that are just eligible to vote, registered. And a lot of people know that the young voters are motivated by issues like abortion, and so they're targeting those young voters and trying to get them registered. And the difference is, if the Democrats can pick up 2 seats in the Senate, they can remove the filibuster and pass abortion rights as well as voting rights and other things. And finally, Biden's come on board with that strategy. So I think this election really, really, really does matter, because it could be the difference between, whether we continue on towards half the nation banning abortion or whether we protect abortion rights nationwide. And, Lindsey Graham has introduced a bill saying abortion should be banned nationwide, which would include Massachusetts. So the choice is really clear. And so I think that the women's movement is trying to communicate that to young women, and I think young women are getting the message.
All right, let's make some predictions. So, show by a show of hands, how many of you think that the Democrats will be in the majority in the Senate after the election? Whoa. Whoa, all right, Jen does. Okay, maybe we have 2. How many of you think the Republicans will be in the majority? Okay, interesting. What about Congress? How many of you think that the Democrats will be in the majority? Ever hopeful, yeah. How many of you think the Republicans will? That's really interesting. Okay, so now we're going to lightning round, right? Rodrigo, what do you think will happen as a result of this election?
I think there's, elections are won on 2 things: turnout and then convincing swing voters. And so for turnout, things what Carrie mentioned, you've got to turn out your base and you've got to energize them with issues that they care the most about. But in the battleground states, there's a considerable amount of swing voters, and we need to split these results into people who are in those states and people who are not decided yet, and what are the top issues that they care about. So I think there's 2 strategies. I think the issues other than the economy are really important to turn out the base. I'm not sure if they're going to be the ones that are going to make the swing voters who already think that they're going to show up choose Democrat versus Republican. And that's a separate strategy. At least we see that with Latino voters very clearly, and the swing Latino voters are really showing in survey after survey that if someone doesn't talk to them about the economy, they're a lot less likely to vote for them. If there's no messaging about the economy and how their election is going to impact their everyday economic life. I'm talking about Latino voters who are wanting to show up, but they don't know who to vote for. So they're waiting for that messaging too. Really important amongst Latino voters also is other types of issues, but the economy shows up a lot.
Doug, what do you think?
So it's a really interesting question. I thought there was no predictions today. Midterm elections go badly for the president's party, and so I would expect it to go badly. It's a matter of how bad. Early returns aren't suggestive that it's going to move in a particularly positive direction. The possibility of holding on to the Senate is in part, I think, driven by the fact that the Republicans have run candidates that maybe were not at the top of the list for candidates that, if you were trying to win the election, you necessarily would have chose for those elections. And so Democrats have hung in some of those races, and maybe a normal election cycle they wouldn't have. Where what I would predict, not outcome-wise, but response-wise, I think it's very easy to predict that there's going to be some allegations of malfeasance and a bunch of very odd court cases percolating out from that point.
All right, you guys.
as someone who studies polling and does polling, I try not to get in the prediction business. My sort of go-to line is, this is not the Ides of March, I'm not the soothsayer. It's a Julius Caesar reference. But I think Doug is right. If we are going to use history as our guide, history tells us, except for two instances, one in 1998 and the other in 2002, that a president's going to lose seats. It's just a matter if it's a bloodbath or just, a few seats. In 2002, that's after 9/11. In 1998, that was Republicans overplaying their hand in the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And so the idea here is that there's none of those enormous issues in our future, at least we hope not. And so the Democrats are going to lose seats. And in the Senate, it's a razor-thin margin. In fact, the Senate is evenly divided except for the control of the vice presidency. And so there's a high likelihood they'll lose both the Senate and the House. And people need to be prepared for that and know that this is not the end of the world. I think this is one of the problems which makes our politics in some ways not normal and our elections not normal. The system is set up such that in 2 years, if you're unhappy with the way things are, you can change it. And so you can be angry, you can be disappointed, but it's within the power of the people in order to change these institutions if and when they have some issue with it.
So I think we're in a historically unprecedented moment. So I think looking to history is not the best guide to what's going to happen. I think there's going to be a tsunami of women voters, and I think women are pissed. They're just pissed. And I think they're going to show up. And the gender voting gap emerged in the 80s under Reagan, and it has grown steadily ever since. I think that the shot in the arm of Dobbs is going to make it greater than ever. And, I don't know that, I think Dems will hold both. I don't know that they'll pick up the 2 in the Senate that they need to actually achieve what they need to achieve, but I'm just going to say it. Along the lines of hope springs eternal. So I'm going to say that Dems will keep both houses.
Interesting. I want to keep you guys in the loop. Is that a question? No. Okay. So one of the things that I hear a lot, and it's kind of a lofty thing to say, which is that this is like a referendum on democracy. You hear that, and I'm always, as a data scientist and not person with expertise like all of you, I always think like, what does that actually mean? And so, this is my question for you. Is it a referendum on democracy? Tatish, you mentioned the system. Unarguably, the system was, the system in the last 6 years or so has been pretty different than presidents before it. If you think about the way Trump used the system and the way Obama used the system before it and, all on, it's been different. And the question is that a trend or is that noise? Is it a referendum on democracy, and what does that actually mean? So I'm going to ask all of you that. Maybe you can enlighten me. Who wants to go first? Doug does.
Yeah, I can take it. So 100%. I think this one, more so than any in my life, certainly, is referendum on democracy. To the extent that many of the democratic elements that across the group, I think we've talked about, there's a disconnect between public opinion and what we, in aggregate, in local communities, and all these sorts of different sort of aggregations, how we think about policy, what our preferences are, and then what's actually sort of happening politically. And so I think there's certainly a referendum on democracy in the sense that the mechanisms that we actually are watching are sort of disappearing. The other part of this is I think there is a real danger in the direction that things are moving as it relates to those elections. And it's not to say that elections in this country historically were well run, but certainly they're going in the wrong direction now. And so if they're going in the wrong direction, they're sort of necessarily, we have to sort of recognize that that's happening and take steps as citizens to sort of stay engaged in that process Or if we choose to sort of let it continue down that path, then certainly we're sort of saying, well, that version of democracy isn't one that we're super excited about. Instead, we just like the democracy where we win, which is unfortunately where some of our folks seem to be heading.
And what do you think the average person can do?
Yes, I didn't know there was follow-ups. So it's really good. I mean, so we've talked about organizational memberships. I think are really important. I think talking about it though also is really important. I think being willing to sort of engage in conversations around this. Certainly, it's something that I've wrestled with in different spaces where you have a conversation about different political figures that maybe are unsavory, and you don't sort of gravitate towards that in polite company. But I think that there's a need to sort of be able to continue to push back in those spaces, also join organizations. A lot of those organizations have been really great. Carrie, you had mentioned when we met before this, the other thing that I'll say here, there's been a phenomenal change in like young people and people that are sort of outside of politics getting engaged in running for something, right? So actually think about something local that you could actually go run for. There's tons of those opportunities. Even here in town, they're constantly looking for people to help out on different committees, other things that you can actually participate on. It would be amazing if we had the perspective of college students who make up such a huge portion of our population here to actually get out and sort of take part in our local governance. I think all of those things, that also sort of acculturates you to the process of representing people, to thinking about those perspectives, participating in those meetings, talking about the issues, and I think that can then sort of spring into what the positions are long term.
I think that involvement's important. I live in Northampton, and I'm a new resident of Northampton as of about a year and a bit ago. And what I was interested to see last year is there was an article in the newspaper on police webcams. Now, I'm a data scientist, and I care a lot about surveillance and the public interest. And there's a whole bunch of interesting questions, which is, should police have webcams? In what instances is that true? When are they intrusive? When are they protective? What happens to the data? You know, who has access to any of it? You know, those kinds of questions. And what I was interested in is there were active people in Northampton who took the time to get knowledgeable about these kinds of questions, these kinds of issues. Many of them college students from Smith, thank you very much. You know, those are the kinds of things that are important because these are, you know, the lives that we all live. And there are issues in our communities. And I do think, you know, engagement starts locally and that we want to be engaged at the bigger level, but you kind of get there through local engagement, through talking to people. So I really appreciate your answer, Doug. Let me just ask all of you, you know, I'd love to go down, and I know our numbers are dwindling and you guys have to get to class, so I don't want to, in some sense, overstay our welcome, but what can people do? What are you doing for the next election? What can people do for the next election and to set themselves up to be involved in elections in the future? What's your good advice? And you know, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, well, I reveal I'm not a U.S. citizen. I grew up in Mexico City. So a little bit talking about the, you know, this is a referendum democracy. For people who are from not outside of the United States, what's happening in the United States right now is just, we cannot believe it. It is so embarrassing, and it's just so, we can't comprehend that in a country that since its foundation there was a peaceful transition of power, where the president, the losing candidate always accepted the results for the first time. That didn't happen in 2020, and then there's a bunch of people in Congress who think that the elections didn't, you know, that who was the winner of the election didn't win. But anyway, that aside, I'm not a U.S. citizen, but there's like plenty of ways. I'm always engaged in politics, despite my lack of citizenship. And directly in elections, since I came to this country in 2008, starting with the Obama election, canvassing and even phone banking has been something that I've done a lot. And I think it's pretty effective in many ways. One, you get to get the feel of what voters are caring about. And then the other is that you give a lot of people really important information. And talking about data and talking about what I'm an expert on, which is Latino voters, we know that if a Latino voter gets registered, well, Latino voters have the lowest turnout rates of all the major ethnic or racial groups when it comes to the percentage of the eligible voters that actually show up. But what we know is that if you register a Latino voter, 80% of them actually show up. And so being in campaigns, and your question was a little bit, the answer to your question was a little bit appalling, because once you register someone to vote, for most racial ethnic groups, it's very likely that they're going to show up and actually turn up. So registration campaigns are, to me, are really important.
All right, Doug, your turn.
Well, I'm just going to be really concrete about this election coming up in 3 weeks. If you know anybody in the 9 battleground states, call them and tell them, please, please vote. And I'll tell you what those 9 states are. Georgia, that's the Warnock race. Arizona, that's Mark Kelly. New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan. Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto. Ohio, Tim Ryan. Pennsylvania, John Fetterman. North Carolina, Cherry Lynn Beasley. Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, and Florida, Val Demings. And go on up to New Hampshire and knock on doors. Hassan is a key race. I think she's doing pretty well, but it's an absolutely key race for Dems to keep the Senate, and it's nearby. And the organization Reproductive Equity Now, which is a reproductive rights org here in Massachusetts, is organizing people to take carpools up to New Hampshire. So if you go on their website, you can volunteer and join them and head on up there in the next couple weeks. So that's just real concrete advice.
That's great.
So all this has been really great suggestions, but I think many just generally to get informed. I think it's easy to rely on your partisan identity or your ideological identity or whatever other identity to sort of think that shapes your political interests and your economic interests, your social interests. But I think the key to an effective democracy is information, and one of the problems we've had is a lack of information and a reliance on the ways in which elites have framed and shaped the storylines regarding the sort of contemporary politics of the nation and the future direction of the nation. So my hope would be, I think, to improve our politics is for folks to get informed, not to rely on the informational sources that are reflective of those identities, but to be exposed to informational sources outside of those identities in shaping what you think your best interests are and the best interests of whatever group that you subscribe to. So I think that's been a central problem in our politics.
I'm going to follow up on that with you to teach a little bit, which is, what should people read? Should they read Breitbart News, the New York Times?
So I will say,
should they listen to Fox? Should they listen to MSNBC?
Yes, I think they should. I do. So I'm someone who has progressive inclinations, and I am a regular viewer of Fox News. I am a regular reader of the Wall Street Journal because I think getting a sense of how the other side views these issues is as important as understanding your own side's issue. And I think if your focus is on, making sure that you can mobilize the most people, it's not just mobilizing your own folks, but it's also potentially winning those conversations that you're likely going to have at Thanksgiving in a few weeks, and to be informed about an understanding of where people are coming from, and then be able to easily, or not, maybe not easily, but being able to effectively counter those arguments and potentially changing attitudes. Because what we're in at this point in time is a highly polarized nation in which there's very little discussion going on across these various divides. And again, being exposed to the other side, having a sense of the central concerns of the other side can craft your message to hopefully mobilize folks to your side. And I don't know if that's happening.
I think that's a really wonderful thing to say, and I do want to say that despite the last half dozen years or so, elections are more than about who wins. It really is about, can we have a conversation on things we disagree with? So I have to say, I think that's really wonderful advice, because if you only read the people who agree with you, you kind of miss out on a more holistic point of view. And it can inform your point of view, or at least inform places to meet in the middle, which is hard to do these days, I have to say. I'm not going to sugarcoat that one. But if you can't meet in the middle, kind of where are we at? I want Doug to be able to share his thoughts about this as well.
I think everyone has. I think the advice that other panelists have offered is fantastic. But the only thing I would maybe add to that is that it's not just this election. It's sort of building habits, the staying informed about the candidates and who these folks are, what they're doing once they're in office. I think to the extent that I'll add anything, and it's a little bit of an aside, one of the things that that's particularly relevant for is, depending on the outcome of the election, it's going to be the gap here when, if you really do think that there's a danger to democracy, and if the Republicans win and all these catastrophic things are going to happen, Democrats are still in power for a short period of time right afterwards. And so you should be thinking not just about like what is the stretch here of who am I going to go vote for, but also how am I going to stay engaged in that period that comes, and then going forward in future periods to ensure that things don't actually go off the rails in the way that some folks might be worried they're going to.
Well, Jen.
May I ask just a follow-up question?
Yes.
I definitely appreciate voting is a huge way to be active and all the other ways of activism. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of the courts, particularly in thinking about subversive concepts, critical race theory, et cetera. So many of these bills which have deliberated and looked to perform that are actually passing now in many states, really affecting no longer just K-12, but also higher education. And I'm wondering, given that they are so clearly a violation of free speech, constant discussion around hot topics and such, will this go all the way up to the Supreme Court? Is this something that could go to the Supreme Court? Well, where do you predict, how do you predict the activism that you will need in the courts and think through whether we even want it to
Doug.
Yeah, so that was basically where I was going to go with it, which is there's two dynamics that are sort of happening simultaneously. One is you have historically conservative views that would suggest that this is a space where maybe we're not going to be too involved. But I think generally speaking, with this court, as we've been describing it, I don't think that there. If the case actually was heard there, I don't think there would be, like the case actually got accepted, I don't think there would be an expectation that there's going to be an outcome that did anything other than protected the ability of school districts to ban the books, that did anything other than suggest that some of these more aggressive policies are acceptable under new and novel sort of perspectives that are being discovered as we go, and very much the way that the independent state legislature story comes out. The one thing I will, and this goes back, Carrie, take a moment here just to talk about, because I think it's kind of important. So Carrie, you used the phrase of MAGA judges. Is that what we had? MAGA Republican judges, MAGA judges, and I think that's a really important phrase, because there's a pushback among sectors of like conservative legal scholars that are basically like, where are these judges going with this? There's no foundation in the way that we've actually been interpreting or ostensibly trying to do our interpretation. There's no foundation for the arguments that we're now seeing. And the independent state legislator one is a really telling version of that, where there are 3 justices have already indicated they're like on board. So Gorsuch, Thomas, and I want to say Kavanaugh, but I'm not sure. But they've basically Alito is the other one that's already. Kavanaugh seems to be very interested, and so it's a question of like, are we going to get one more vote on board for this theory that's going to sort of upend everything? And that goes to this idea, which is the historical, like the conservatives that have this real deep bent on originalism, and sort of the true believers on originalism are like, this isn't originalism. This is made up now, and that's part of the this is made up purely for political gain, and we recognize that, and they're sort of distancing themselves from this. Michael Ludig is the example of one of the folks that was out there with Pence and others, sort of pushing this. Calabrese, Stephen Calabrese is another one that's like a leading sort of more figure in the space that's sort of coming out and saying this is too far. And so it'll be interesting to see if that plays out. But with the court as it exists right now, I mean, Alito did victory laps after the Dobbs decision, and so it does not suggest that they're sort of going to back away from making potentially controversial decisions.
I think trying to appeal to the state Supreme Courts might be more effective. That's what's happening with a lot of these abortion laws, because state constitutions are quite strong and have a lot of provisions that people can challenge some of these kinds of laws under. So I know that's happening in the sphere of abortion, but I suspect it will happen in that area as well.
I was trying to fast forward to mine.
Well, I want to thank everybody who was here, and especially everybody who stayed. Thank you all for staying.
Yeah.
And I really want to thank SBS, the Public Interest Technology Initiative, and especially our panelists who are just fantastic and thought-provoking, and we really appreciate your time. So thank all of you.
Thank you all.